Good morning and welcome to my new mic. I am very hopeful that this video turns out well, and I'm being quiet because some people in this house are sleeping, but it is Sunday morning and I really wanted to share this video. I know many of you, even though I've had a really great Rode mic attached to my camera this whole time, I often hear you say, the sound isn't great. I think it's because of the hardwood floors. So I ordered a new mic, but the cord is not that long. And so in the next video, I'm hoping to not have to hold it towards my face. But I'm very curious to see what you think about the sound. So please let me know. I have another video I'm probably going to post that I shot a few weeks ago. It talks about the truths we all need to face when we have childhood trauma. But I have been really wanting to share a video that I made in the last few days. And it really is about the relationship between complex PTSD and what Pete Walker talks about in terms of self-mothering and self-fathering. And I took that and applied it to how that affects your own attachment system or pattern. Remember that attachment has 4 main styles: anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and secure. But it's also a spectrum, and we can lean into other styles. Certainly with different partners, they can bring up different parts of us. So keep that in mind. But I thought it might be helpful for you to approach this reparenting dynamic through the lens of your own attachment styles. So let's get into it. Really quickly, if you're new here, I'm a licensed psychologist, and this whole, channel is really about childhood and trauma, sometimes autism or neurodivergence. I say that weird when I talk fast. I'm also going to slow down. Many of you know my biggest task in this content creation journey has been to slow down, and it is not in my nature to talk slowly. Okay. So let's get into it. What is self-mothering and self-fathering? I don't necessarily know that I buy into all of these things in terms of, gender or mother-father, but I do think that biologically there's an energy around feminine and masculine energy. And I'm not talking about the woo-woo parts of that. I say woo-woo because I think it's been used to be hurtful for people in some ways, to manipulate them about choosing partners and cults and all kinds of weird stuff. But what I want to talk about here is that ideally, historically, and the research in attachment was done on mothers, as that has been the place where we look at what's called the primary caregiver, right? The main person. And while it can be anyone with any kind of energy, it has historically been mothers and continues to be more often than not. But like I said, that doesn't mean that you can't be a nurturing, loving father as a primary parent, or just parent, however you identify, okay? All right. But in Pete's book, he talks about mothering as being about compassion, self-compassion, and nurturing. So to re-mother yourself or self-mother, we're talking about a connection to that energy that is compassionate. When Pete talks about self-fathering, he's referring to that inner way of protection, of protecting yourself. And so that's what we're talking about. 2 concepts here: self-compassion, really self-nurturing, and self-protection. So we're going to apply those as they relate to your attachment styles. Now, what Pete also says is that safety is at the heart of healing what we could not give to ourselves, meaning that that's the one thing in childhood. I talk so much about safety and stability that in a childhood without that, you have no power to change that. You just have to basically survive it. And so he says that self-compassion is the domicile or the home of recovery, and self-protection is the foundation. So ideally that you need both of these. He says when self-compassion is sufficiently established as a home base to return to in difficult times, an urge to be self-protective naturally arises from it. So once again, self-mothering is about being lovable, deserving love, inner acceptance, and it's about a process of understanding how to engage with yourself that way. And then self-fathering, he says, heals wounds of being helpless to protect yourself, like I was saying in childhood, from parental wounding. And so the self-fathering aims to bring self-assertiveness and self-protection. And then the interesting thing he talks about is this idea of unconditional love, and that a child learns, ideally feels unconditional love, right, from the time they're newborn. You're protecting them, gazing at them, loving them. But part of becoming a human in any society is understanding that there are conditions. And in really dysfunctional families, the conditions are significant blocks to being loved and accepted and seen, because the conditions are about the parent's belief system, world views, whatever, traumas. And so part of this maturity is realizing that, you can't even love yourself unconditionally in many ways, right? There's always going to be this reality of that society has said, well, I'm only lovable when I'm this weight or when I achieve this success. Like, we're always battling against that. But that part of growing up is understanding that. And that's why I think it's important we say, you may love, people, you say, without conditions, but there are things that they might do or say that could cause you to change that. And maybe your love doesn't change, but the way you engage and changes. So the reason why I bring that up is that I think that there's this false belief that you can just love yourself unconditionally. And if you just heal that, everything is fine. And I just think that the goal is to love yourself without conditions, to accept yourself, to protect yourself, but to always hold that's going to pop up in your mind and to challenge it. All right. So, really quickly too, I want to talk about actually the orphanage study that David Brown and Dan Elliott talk about in their textbook on attachment, because that is really about the relationship between complex PTSD and attachment. And what they said and what they argue is that when they looked at the kind of wounding and damage that happened in orphanages, they found that the kids who were placed in orphanages because there were complicated family dynamics, let's say there were too many kids, there was poverty, but if they came in with a better security system, actually, a more stable, a more secure attachment system, that the same kids who came in without secure attachment, when all of the kids endured very damaging wounding, and I'm using the word wounding in place of another word, and I'll post it down below in the comments why. The kids who did better, who fared better in life, were the ones who entered the orphanage with a more stable sense of security in terms of attachment, and that it is these later acts of child wounding to the attachment system that cause damage. So I could make a whole video on this, but you might want to Google. There are several orphanage studies, but it really is one that, when we talk about attachment, is really, I think, interesting to think about in terms of what is complex trauma. They argue the complex trauma is what happens when the attachment system isn't able to protect a child one way or the other, and or it benefits them one way or the other in terms of surviving difficult relational wounds. Okay? All right, so let's get into it. So when we talk about the self-mothering tasks, when you have a more anxious attachment system, let's do those first. We're talking about, and remember, anxious attachment is about inconsistent, unpredictable responses from caregivers, and an over-involvement in the caregiver's state of mind. So a lot of inconsistencies, and it could be for lots of reasons, right? From the parent's physical presence to their mood and mind, and a lot of spilling over of the parent's anxieties, worries, fears. And I've talked a lot about this in other videos, that these parents were often really good at fear. They knew how to do protection and fear with their babies because they were afraid of a lot of things happening. And in some ways that created a sense of confidence and bond for them. So like, oh, don't touch that. Oh, don't go outside. It's too dangerous. And if you think about how the world has evolved, I think many of us have become more and more anxious because of the world we live in and our exposure to bad things happening. But that's the heart of it. It's about overexposure and about inconsistency, consistent inconsistency. And as I've talked about, as a result of this, a lot of those with anxious attachment have what's called an outside in orientation. So they are first looking from the outside. I have another cat here. I swear I always do. They're looking from the outside at others to then determine when they're okay. So hypervigilance scanning, not necessarily for danger and threat like we might find in more disorganized attachment, but there's a lot of if you're good, I'm good. If you're good, I'm good, which creates the heart of a lot of people pleasing and compulsive caretaking, which can be very common in anxious attachment, right? So you have all of those things happening. So if you're going to work on your self-mothering, and this is you're going to want to work on how you tend to shame and manage and identify your emotional feelings and needs. And that the way that you protect that is you identify them. Now we're going into self-fathering, and you begin to set boundaries, to make requests, to name them, right? So a lot of it is pushing down what you want in the service of others. So in the self-mothering, you're identifying it and honoring it and naming it. And then setting a life around you that reflects that, right? So you're saying what you feel, what you need. So that would be the more assertive, protective part. The next thing is you want to learn to stop really often gaslighting yourself and saying, well, you don't feel that way, or you're being dramatic, or your things don't matter. If you express what you want, you're going to lose your partner. So you validate. You do a lot of like, it's okay that I feel this way. I may not want to respond in ways I've done, in the past, but it's okay that I feel this way. I'm allowed. I deserve these feelings. And then same thing, you would set and hold that validation in relationships with others. You wouldn't start to sacrificing it. You wouldn't start to sacrifice it in terms of people pleasing and minimizing. So that would be the more self-fathering. In terms of your hypervigilance, that is very common, once again, that you are a threat detector and very sensitive to everything oftentimes because you're looking for more consistency. You want to acknowledge that that's something that you do. It's not a bad thing, but that sometimes you overread and overinterpret what that means. And so looking at how you want to be more assertive with that is to say to yourself, okay, I'm feeling really anxious and worried about this, but in a kind of classic cognitive response, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I do believe it's helpful in some ways, is like, what is the evidence for this, right? So you come in a protective way and you say, okay, what's the evidence? Do I need to set a boundary here? Do I need to like honor that I'm feeling anxiety, but that my partner is not doing anything? There's no evidence. So you kind of hold yourself accountable in a protective way. The next thing is that you want to understand and honor that you have these strong urges to do things, to protest behaviors, to push back, to show that you're worthy of love, to get your partner to respond, that is really about anxiety you hold. And that while you can't necessarily change that, the way you want to work with that in your self-fathering dynamic is to once again not do things that you know will hurt you. So if you play games with your partner and immediately they respond, which those games tend to work, but later you create more instability, it's not really serving you. Your partner starts to think, well, you're just game playing with me, or, you're just trying to get me to do what you want. And you honor that that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to extinguish your own anxiety by getting them to respond. So you start to work on protecting yourself through not doing those things, through distraction techniques, through tolerance distress, as in like the DBT skills and dialectical behavior therapy. You work on managing those impulses. You want to reduce the inner critic that tells you, that's that self-compassion part that tells you it's not really self-compassionate. It's everything is your fault. They're mad at you. You're in trouble. They're going to leave you. Once again, with love and compassion, you honor where that comes from and that you feel it. But maybe you work on, reacting. Maybe you work on reacting in ways I'm saying that are damaging to yourself, right? So you're so harsh on yourself that you deprive yourself of things, or you just find ways to shame and blame yourself. And so to self-father would be to say, hey, it's understandable that you want to criticize yourself and be perfect here, because in childhood, perfection made you think that you'd be safe. But just like in childhood, it didn't. And all this really does is hurt you. So your workaholism, your busyism, whatever it is, your constant need that it's never enough, to work on things like, is this good enough? Can I be okay with, no, a B is not an F, right? If I didn't get this promotion, I can work towards the next one. It doesn't make me a bad person or a bad employee, because that's often where it goes. You want to validate at the core that your caretaking abilities, that is something you can give yourself a lot of love for, that you are good. You are a good and loving and safe caretaker. And the only challenge in protecting that is trying to look at who is actually worthy of that. And that when you do that, you sacrifice your own pain and parts of yourself. And if you were going to self-father, you would say, okay, your inclination is to do 10 things for this person, maybe just do 5, and then look at 5 things to do for yourself, for example, or 2 things for others and 5 things for yourself. That it is a beautiful part of you, but it also serves to keep you in that unworthy state, because you're always rotating around what everyone else wants and therefore denying your own needs. But it also is a beautiful part of who you are. All right, now let's go to the more avoidant self-mothering and self-fathering and talk about what that looks like. Here, what we've learned is that the research says, as I've said this so many times, I know if you know this, you're like, oh God, please move on, but that the infants experienced repeated maternal rejection. That wasn't necessarily rejection, but it was a repeated dismissing of the child's bids and needs for connection. And so the child learns to stop acting in a way that is activating to ask for their needs to be met. And they start suppressing and deactivating. And they start taking really good care of themselves and becoming what we often call pseudo-independent. They often become very self-reliant. And at the heart of that, what the trigger is a vulnerability in themselves first and in others, creates this need to kind of like a turtle go back into the shell and self-protect. And so when you have lived a childhood where you learn to take care of your own needs, you're not going to easily want to hand those over to someone else. It's going to feel very unsafe. And so oftentimes in the beginning, you're not really, like, let's say when you meet someone, there's not a lot of risk of vulnerability because you're still building connection. So you can be more loving and more available. But the minute it gets real, you're like, oh my gosh, wait a minute. This is like actually scary and not safe, because it triggers your own feelings of need and loss. And it challenges that self-reliance, which is dangerous to do when you've built a life around this. And that's why when you're avoidant, you can't expect your avoidant partner, or if you are avoidant, to completely relinquish this part of themselves. It is how they've survived. But it only works if you want to be involved in changing it, if you have this attachment style. So in other words, for all these videos around avoidance, you can't just sacrifice your entire self to make your avoidant partner happy, because you'll extinguish all of your needs. And if you're avoidant, you can't stay in your, I'm not going to give that up because it's too dangerous. You have to, little by little, be willing to risk. Okay. So the first thing is you often tend to shut down your own needs. You minimize, you numb, you shut them down. And to have compassion would be to start to identify, what do I feel? What do I need? And it can be really difficult to even identify what you feel. So maybe it starts with you trying to just observe yourself, noticing that you're all of a sudden in a bad mood, or you watched a movie that you never cry, but you watched that movie and you got tearful. What was that about? To look at what it might feel like in your body when you're angry, when you're watching that movie and you feel sad and you never cry at anything else but movies. What's happening in your body, right? Or to say to yourself, I wonder what would someone feel like if someone did that to me or someone else? What would I think a person would feel? So cultivating and working on your tendency to shut down. Maybe you do this through workaholism, once again, busyness, through numbing, through substances, and trying to just begin to understand that that's what you're doing, and start to work on identifying those emotions. And the way you work on that is you start to say, okay, I'm going to give myself the space, but I'm going to trust myself as I protect myself that I can handle these feelings, these responses, these relationships. The next thing is these kids often had less physical affection. And so it can be really uncomfortable. And yet you might have a partner who wants to hold your hand more or engage with you in some way. And as I've learned more about neurodivergence, certain things like eye contact might not work as well for you, or certain types of touching. But whatever you can tolerate in a way that feels safe, if you want to build connection with a partner, especially everything outside of the act of intimacy, which often can be fine for avoidance, but everything else is triggering, is to start to put yourself in the way of trusting yourself that you can take risks and experiment and find little ways to connect, that you're not shutting it down and not having compassion, or maybe you're shaming yourself. Why am I like this? Compassion would be to say, I understand why I'm like this, but I don't necessarily want to stay in it. So what can I do that's more assertive, more protective in a way that I can trust myself, but also build connection? The next one is that oftentimes people with avoidant attachment don't really have an identity of their unique self. A lot of what they did was develop self in response to caregivers. And so to culture that, to develop it, to look at what are my beliefs and needs and hobbies and passions, and then what can I do to cultivate those things more? That would be a more assertive way of engaging with developing a sense of self. The next thing that's often common is because of this self-reliance and this sort of like environment for those with avoidance, there can be a lot of judgment and controlling issues, a lot of rigidity that happens. And so part of the self-compassion is to say, all right, I know why I have to be this way. I get it, but it doesn't actually serve me. And I need to work on assertively letting that go a little bit. The dishwasher, as I talk about, doesn't have to be loaded this only certain way. I'm sorry, it doesn't. There is value in someone helping you, and your control and rigidity push people away. And if you don't want to be with people, that is fine. But if you want to work on your avoidance and increase connection, it starts with not shaming yourself and having compassion, but also pushing yourself to be actually more free in how you approach things little by little. These are little steps. You can't just like rip the Band-Aid off overnight, right? So a lot of this is like learning to self-soothe and work on your shame, a lot of the harshness of how you approach the world with yourself and others, and to begin to take risks and to challenge, identify, and actually a protective mechanism would to be to say with assertiveness, I'm going to let someone else help me with co-regulation, with self-soothing. I'm not going to always retreat like that turtle in the shell and not let anyone in. So it really is a process of challenging that kind of like harsh and rigid dynamic. And it's not easy to do. I know that. The last attachment style is about disorganized, often called fearful avoidant. It's this combination that often is rooted in fear. Fear is often the core of this one. And this would be if you had caregivers who, what is kind of the hallmark of this style, where the parent was the source of safety and also the source of fear. So the same attachment figure that is the person who feeds you theoretically and provides for you in whatever ways is also the person you have to protect yourself from. And a lot of this is on a spectrum too, right? So we can have very intense traumatized caregivers. We can have, as I've talked about, caregivers like my own parents who really struggled with rage and emotional control and dysregulation, but could also be loving and funny and engaging. And so it's like, that is the heart of what I call eggshell parents. A lot of parents where you just never know what to expect. And whether it's a dissociation in a parent, the research does show that there's a lot of unresolved trauma in these parents potentially. And I think it can run the gamut from different disorders to even autism, dysregulation, ADHD. But whatever it is, we're not just talking about the parent being sometimes upset. We're talking about often wide swings, right? And that is where the source of safety is also the source of fear. And so here it's difficult because you have basically everything I just talked about triggers on both ends of both anxious and avoidant attachment. So the way this shows up is in a lot of distrust, a lot of fear, a lot of, sort of being afraid you're going to lose people you love, but also being afraid of them engulfing you and consuming you. I think there are a lot more of us than we recognize who are on the maybe mid to lower spectrum of disorganized, but where we really did have caregivers who had a loss of control in some way. But it wasn't always bad. And that's where I mean, it can obviously be always bad, but it wasn't. And so we can have these, dissociations ourselves, these mood shifting states. We can have a difficult time with balance in our lives, a lot of hypervigilance, a lot of internalized shame and perfectionism and those inner and outer critics. And so it really is a combination of everything I've talked about, where you want to work on validating all of those experiences. Remember also alongside the source of safety and fear, it's also called fear without solution, meaning what are you going to do about it, right? Is this over-involvement in the caretaker's state of mind, like an anxious attachment? And so we can have a lot of this behavior where we're just always scanning, and we're really scanning and detecting, not just for loss or consistency, but for threat. And so all of that can affect as we look at how to have compassion for ourselves, to work on, like, let's say, for example, if we dissociate, to work on grounding techniques. That's that compassion for what's happening, and that, okay, I understand why you do this, but to self-father and to assertively protect yourself, you want to do things to put yourself in the way of things that provide protection, like grounding techniques. You can Google those. Emotion regulation skills, as you honor your feelings, but working on how to manage those. A lot of that can come with DBT skills. I've made some videos and a book I recommend with a lot of techniques about mindfulness and regulation and tolerating distress without blowing and freaking out. And a lot of this is really difficult when you become a parent, right? It's hard enough to manage our own emotional worlds, but when you add another human to that or partners to that, it can become really difficult. Also, depending upon your own neurobiology, right? Genetics, things like that. So you're identifying, you're honoring, and then you're learning to do things like understanding that you can trust yourself to handle whatever comes, that you can challenge your rigidity. That would be a way of, that protective dynamic, that you can take time to build safety in relationships, that there's no rush. So you don't have to shame and blame yourself. Why can't I get closer? But you keep taking little baby steps closer, things like that. So all of these are about the heart of managing all of that internal dysregulation inside that our bodies are responding to in our attachment patterns. And I think it's difficult to have compassion for yourself when, a lot of your survival has been about minimizing your needs, being a perfectionist, numbing whatever it is, numbing your own desires like an avoidant attachment. And so these are all processes of growing and healing. But I would encourage you to figure out what your attachment style is or where you think you generally lean, and ask yourself, and maybe it's through, websites or books or other places, if I want to really work on reparenting myself, I want to look at the two core things, self-compassion and self-protection. Where do I need more self-compassion, and where do I need more protection? That could be more boundaries. It could be taking more risks and trusting yourself. It could be about activities you engage in or not, things you say yes or no to. But those are the two dynamics we really want to focus on, because like the book I was talking about at the beginning says, you can't go back and remove yourself from those helpless states. If they were fear states, if they were anxious states, if they were states of self-reliance, but you can begin to create those conditions in your own life. And that is what I think is incredibly important, is that a lot of this work is about, as I've said in my courses and other things like that, it's not just about thinking your way through things, right? It's about setting up your life in a way that says you are worthy, you are lovable. And if you weren't protected in childhood, you can start to work on protecting yourself now. If you didn't get enough love in childhood, you'll never be able to replace that. But you can start to create loving conditions in your own life, because it really is an act of self-love, for example, to say yes or no to something, to set a boundary. That word is used ridiculously so much, but it is true. Or if you're uncovering parts of yourself in terms of like neurodivergence, like I've talked about, whatever this is, it's about saying, look, this is what I need to be my best self. I don't do well. It's no wonder why I failed at networking while I would go to these networking events, and my inner critic and my massive social anxiety. I could get myself there, but I couldn't stay. And I felt so much shame about that. And to now understand for so many reasons why I did that, because I was getting a doctorate, for example, raising 4 kids, doing all these things at once. Why couldn't I go do this thing? So it's about understanding your brain, your childhood, and working on ways to lovingly say, here's where I can accept and have compassion, and here's where I want to push myself to grow. So anyway, I just finished this whole video. I know I talked a little bit fast because I'm trying to get this done this morning before everyone wakes up and the day gets crazy. But, and I also wanted to try my new mic. And so I'm just praying that I can use this video and that somehow the sound is better for you. So anyway, thanks for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon.